Picture the alert hitting every phone at the exact same second. The global economy has just crossed $100 trillion. And inside that number sits a question nobody in Washington, Beijing, or Bengaluru can fully answer yet, which is who actually gets to keep the biggest slice of it. This is not a hypothetical headline dreamed up for a documentary. In the spring of 2026, Gallup's chairman stood in front of 10,000 economists gathered in Washington for the IMF and World Bank meetings and told them the world economy had just closed out 2025 at $120 trillion, and that, over the next 25 years, another $100 trillion in fresh economic output is expected to pour into the system, growing at roughly 2.5% a year until global GDP touches something close to $220 trillion by 2050. He called it new economic energy raining down across every country on Earth. And then he said something that should stop any American watching this in their tracks. For 20 years, nearly every economist on the planet predicted China would routed the United States economically. And it simply never happened, which he called one of the biggest misreads by economists in the last 100 years. That single admission is the real starting point of this story, because if the smartest people in the room can be that wrong about who wins the future, then the only honest way to understand where America stands today is to follow the money, the people, and the technology as they actually move, not as anyone predicted they would. Meet Elena Torres, 34 years old, running a mid-sized robotics and automation company out of a converted warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. 5 years ago, she had 11 employees and a single contract retrofitting factory floors with vision sensors. Today, she has close to 200 people on payroll, contracts stretching from Detroit to Munich, and a waiting list of customers who want her machines before her company can even finish building them. Elena is not unique. She is one node in a pattern that shows up across almost every high-growth American industry right now, and understanding her story means understanding the real forces behind that $100 trillion headline. Start with the number everyone actually agrees on. The United States economy is worth about $32.4 trillion in 2026, according to the International Monetary Fund, making it comfortably the largest economy on Earth and still responsible for roughly a quarter of everything the entire planet produces in a year. China sits in second place at a little under $21 trillion, and the gap between them, rather than closing the way so many predicted 2 decades ago, has in some ways widened because the United States kept shifting its economy towards services, software, and high-value innovation, while China's growth engine, built on construction, exports, and manufacturing, started running into its own structural limits. But raw size is not the same as momentum, and momentum is where this story gets interesting. In the first quarter of 2026, something unusual showed up in the government's own growth data. Spending on software, servers, and data center equipment contributed more to America's economic growth than the entire consumer economy did, even though household spending is roughly 20 times bigger as a share of GDP than the tech and AI build-out. Some analysts at the St. Louis Federal Reserve calculated that AI-related investment alone drove somewhere around 1.5 percentage points of total GDP growth in the first quarter, while other estimates from banks and research shops put the AI investment share of growth as high as 40% for the year. Big technology companies disclosed plans to spend somewhere in the range of $700 billion in 2026 alone building out the physical infrastructure, the chips, the data centers, and the electrical capacity that artificial intelligence needs to run at scale, an investment wave that some economists compare directly to the railroad boom of the 19th century or the dot-com build-out of the late 1990s, except bigger and faster. Not everyone agrees this is pure upside. Goldman Sachs economists ran their own numbers and concluded that once you strip away the hype, all that AI capital spending contributed close to nothing to measurable economic growth last year, a conclusion that set off a genuine argument among serious economists about whether America is experiencing a real productivity revolution or watching a very expensive infrastructure bet that has not yet proven it can pay for itself. Elena has an opinion on this because she lives it every day. Her company does not sell AI hype. It sells machines that replace repetitive human labor on factory floors, and every single one of her customers is telling her the same thing. Labor is expensive, skilled workers are hard to find, and automation is no longer optional if they want to keep their prices competitive against manufacturers overseas. The tension between a labor market that cannot supply enough skilled workers and a technology wave promising to solve the shortage by replacing the need for workers altogether sits at the center of America's entire economic story right now. Meanwhile, in China, the picture looks almost like a mirror image. Beijing set its official 2026 growth target at just 4.5% to 5%, the lowest target the country has set since 1991. A quiet acknowledgement that the old playbook of building infrastructure and flooding the world with exports has largely run its course. China's property market, which spent 2 decades as a primary engine of household wealth and local government revenue, remains stuck in a prolonged downturn, And that alone has been enough to drag down consumer confidence and household spending, even as the government pours resources into advanced manufacturing, robotics, semiconductors, and clean energy. China is not falling apart, and anyone telling you that is not looking at the data honestly, because Chinese industrial production and high-tech manufacturing sectors is still posting double-digit growth, and China remains the dominant global producer of electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and a growing share of the world's advanced robotics. But the labor market weakness inside China is real and structurally difficult to fix, because the very technologies China is racing to dominate, things like automated manufacturing and industrial AI, do not create nearly as many jobs per dollar invested as the old construction and assembly line economy did. So, while Beijing chases technological leadership, it is simultaneously grappling with a domestic demand problem that no factory upgrade can solve on its own. Now look at India, because if there is one country in this story whose story keeps surprising forecasters in the opposite direction from China, it is India. Through the 2025 to 2026 fiscal year, India's economy grew at roughly 7.6%, according to World Bank data, making it not just the fastest growing major economy in the world, but one growing nearly twice as fast as China's official target. India's economy has now crossed roughly $4.15 trillion, putting it as the sixth largest economy globally, and its growth story looks completely different from either America's tech-driven expansion or China's manufacturing pivot. India is riding a genuine demographic dividend, with a median age still under 30 and a working age population that will not even peak until the 2050s, in sharp contrast to the aging populations of China, Japan, and much of Europe. India's information technology and business process outsourcing sector alone now exports more than $100 billion worth of services a year, and the country is racing to build a domestic semiconductor manufacturing industry through its semiconductor mission, with commercial chip production expected to begin ramping up this year. India even had its first successful private orbital rocket launch in 2026, a milestone that would have sounded like science fiction for an Indian company just a decade ago. Gallup's own research, buried inside that same $100 trillion report, found something worth pausing on. When they measured what they call gross domestic ambition, essentially the share of a country's workforce that is actively engaged and driven to innovate, the United States led the world at 32% of its workforce, with India close behind at 23%. Both well above the roughly 20% global average. In other words, the two countries best positioned to capture the coming wave of global economic growth, by Gallup's own metric, are the United States and India, not China, a finding that quietly reshapes how you should think about the next 25 years of global competition. Back in Columbus, Elena is dealing with a problem that has nothing to do with demand and everything to do with people. She needs engineers, and specifically she needs machine learning engineers and control specialists, and the American labor market simply is not producing enough of them fast enough. For years, companies like hers leaned on the H-1B visa program to bring in specialized foreign talent, and the data on that program is striking. Research going back over a decade found that a 10% increase in H-1B visa admissions is associated with up to a 2% increase in overall invention and patenting, and more than half of America's billion-dollar startup companies, the so-called unicorns, were founded or co-founded by immigrants, many of whom first arrived on an H-1B visa. The Congressional Budget Office has projected that the wave of immigration into the United States between 2021 and 2026 will add close to $9 trillion in additional nominal GDP over the following decade. But in September of 2025, the federal government imposed a new $100,000 fee on new H-1B petitions filed from outside the country, an enormous jump from the $2,000 to $5,000 range the fee used to occupy, and the effect was immediate. H-1B registrations for the following fiscal year dropped by nearly 40%, and surveys of prospective international students found many reconsidering whether studying and working in the United States was still worth the risk and expense, even after officials clarified the fee did not technically apply to students. Elena watched two of her best recruiting prospects, both graduate students from overseas universities, quietly accept offers in Toronto instead, because Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United Arab Emirates have all been actively courting the exact kind of skilled tech talent that used to default to Silicon Valley or Austin or Columbus almost automatically. This is the part of the competitiveness story that rarely makes the highlight reel next to a $100 trillion headline, because the same country leading the world in venture capital, unicorn creation, and AI investment is simultaneously making it harder and more expensive for the very talent that lead to come in the front door. And the unicorn numbers really are extraordinary, worth sitting with for a moment. As of the middle of 2026, there are close to 1,800 companies worldwide valued at over $1 billion, and the United States alone accounts for somewhere between 60 and 75 of the newest ones created just this year, more than triple the number coming out of China, which sits in a distant second place. Global startup investment hit a record $510 billion in the first half of 2026 alone. And the money is no longer just chasing chatbots and consumer AI apps. It is flowing into AI infrastructure, robotics, defense technology, semiconductors, and healthcare automation, which tells you something important. Investors are betting that the next decade of American economic dominance will be built on physical, tangible technology as much as on software. One of the most talked about new companies of the year, an AI automation startup called Prometheus, co-founded by Jeff Bezos, reached a $41 billion valuation after a $12 billion funding round, led by major Wall Street banks, the kind of number that would have sounded absurd for a company that barely existed 2 years earlier. This is the flip side of Elena's visa headache. The same American system that is currently squeezing out some foreign talent is still pulling in more global venture capital than the rest of the world combined, because investors still believe, rightly or wrongly, that the deepest capital markets, the best research universities, and the most entrepreneurial culture on earth remain concentrated inside the United States. Now, walk with Elena into a slightly less flattering part of this story, the one involving the federal government's own balance sheet. As of the middle of 2026, the total gross national debt of the United States has crossed $39 trillion, having added roughly $1 trillion in barely over 6 months, a pace of borrowing that means the government is adding somewhere close to $5 to $8 billion in new debt every single day. The average interest rate on that debt has climbed to around 3.33%, more than double what it was 5 years earlier. And net interest payments on the debt, the money the government spends simply servicing what it already owes, are now consuming somewhere between 14 and 15% of the entire federal budget, on track to keep climbing for the next decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen has warned publicly that the country is approaching what economists call fiscal dominance, the point at which the sheer size of government borrowing needs starts to constrain the central bank's ability to fight inflation, forcing painful trade-offs that used to be purely theoretical. One economist at the University of Pennsylvania went so far as to argue that when you properly account for future obligations like Social Security and Medicare, the real burden of American debt is not the $39 trillion headline figure, but closer to $100 trillion. A shell game, in his words, rather than outright fraud, but a warning sign nonetheless about how much of America's future growth is already spoken for before it even happens. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every celebration of record stock markets and blockbuster AI investment. The same government that needs to fund infrastructure, education, defense, and technological competitiveness is doing so while spending an ever-growing share of its budget just paying interest on money it already borrowed, which crowds out the kind of long-term public investment that built America's technological edge in the first place. Elena feels this pressure in a completely different, much more personal way. She makes good money now, comfortably more than the national median household income, and she still cannot afford to buy a house anywhere near her own factory. The median price of an existing home in the United States crossed roughly $400,000 in early 2026, and by the standard measure that most conventional lenders use, affording that median home now requires a household income well over $110,000 a year, a level tens of thousands of dollars above what the actual median American household earns. In California, the least affordable state in the country, households need to earn something like double the median income just to afford a median-priced home, and nationally there is now a shortage of more than 4 million housing units, a supply gap that keeps prices elevated even when mortgage rates ease. Monthly mortgage payments on a median-priced home have nearly doubled since 2020, and the number of homes available for under $75,000 in household income eligibility has fallen 60% compared to just 7 years earlier. This is not a side issue to the $100 trillion growth story. It is arguably the most important part of it, because an economy can post record GDP numbers, record stock market highs, and record venture capital inflows, while the majority of its own citizens feel like the basic building block of financial stability, owning a home, is drifting permanently out of reach. Economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco have found that housing prices have tracked closely with average income, which is heavily skewed upward by the highest earners, but have dramatically outpaced median income, the number that reflects what a typical family actually takes home, which means the gains from America's technological boom are not spreading evenly through the population. And that gap between average and typical experience is exactly the kind of quiet instability that tends not to show up in a headline GDP figure until it eventually does. Now, zoom back out to the technological frontier, because this is where America's long-term bet is really being placed. In May of 2026, the Commerce Department announced roughly $2 billion in CHIPS Act funding split across 9 companies, with the largest single award going to IBM to build what officials describe as America's first dedicated large-scale quantum chip foundry located in Albany, New York. Smaller but still substantial awards went to companies with names most people have never heard of: Global Foundries, Rigetti, Inflection, Atom Computing, PsiQuantum, Quantinuum, D-Wave, and Dirac, each pursuing a genuinely different physical approach to building a working quantum computer, because unlike classical computing chips, the industry has not yet agreed on which underlying quantum technology will actually win. Officials describe the strategy explicitly as a portfolio approach, spreading bets across multiple technological paths at once, rather than picking a single winner too early, precisely because the stakes of getting this wrong, whether in national defense, cryptography, advanced materials science, or drug discovery, are considered too high to leave to chance. This sits alongside the broader Chips and Science Act, originally passed with rare bipartisan support back in 2022, specifically to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity after the pandemic exposed just how dependent the entire American economy, from cars to smartphones to fighter jets, had become on chip factories located almost entirely in Taiwan and South Korea. Elena's own robotics company depends on a steady, reliable supply of specialized chips. And she watched firsthand during the pandemic supply shock how a shortage on the other side of the world could freeze her entire production line for months. That memory is part of why she is not naive about America's advantages. She knows that being the largest economy in the world and even leading in AI investment, unicorn creation, and now quantum computing funding does not automatically guarantee anything 10 or 20 years from now. Because Gallup's own history lesson about the misread on China proves that confident predictions about who wins the future are worth very little. What actually seems to matter, based on everything converging in 2026, is a small set of very specific things repeating across every part of this story. It is whether a country's workforce stays genuinely engaged and ambitious, the exact metric where America and India currently lead the world, while global employee engagement overall has fallen to its lowest level since the pandemic, costing the global economy an estimated $10 trillion a year in lost productivity, according to Gallup's own workplace research. It is whether a country can keep attracting and retaining the specific skilled talent that builds unicorn companies and quantum foundries, even while short-sighted immigration policy sometimes works directly against that goal. It is whether massive capital investment in AI and infrastructure eventually translates into real, broad-based productivity gains, or whether it turns out to be an extremely expensive bet that mostly enriches a small number of already dominant technology companies, while ordinary households watch housing and living costs rise faster than their wages. It is whether a government can fund the next generation of research, education, and infrastructure, while an ever larger share of its budget gets consumed simply paying interest on debt already accumulated. And it is whether the gains from record economic growth get distributed widely enough that the country holding the largest economy in human history does not simultaneously become a country where a majority of its own citizens feel increasingly locked out of the basic promise that growth was supposed to deliver in the first place. None of these questions have obvious answers yet, and anyone selling you a confident answer either way is doing exactly what Gallup's own chairman warned against, treating backward-looking data as if it can reliably predict a future that has not happened yet. What we do know, sitting here in the middle of 2026, is that the raw numbers are genuinely staggering. A $32 trillion American economy still producing roughly a quarter of everything the world makes. An AI investment boom contributing somewhere between a third and nearly half of all economic growth this year, depending on whose calculation you trust. $1,800 billion startups worldwide, with the United States alone responsible for the majority of new ones created in 2026. A national debt closing in on $40 trillion and adding $1 trillion more roughly every 6 months. A housing market where the typical family now needs an income tens of thousands of dollars above what they actually earn just to afford the typical home. A rival in China deliberately slowing its own growth targets to the lowest level in over 3 decades, while still dominating global manufacturing and electric vehicles, batteries, and solar technology. A rising power in India growing nearly twice as fast as China, riding a demographic wave that will not crest for another 30 years, and increasingly building its own chips, satellites, and rockets, rather than simply exporting labor and services to everyone else. And sitting quietly underneath all of it, $2 billion freshly committed dollars racing to build the physical hardware for quantum computers that, within a decade, could either revolutionize drug discovery and materials science, or, depending on how the geopolitics shake out, become the next arena where nations compete for supremacy the same way they once competed over nuclear weapons or space exploration. Elena Torres does not spend her days thinking in terms of trillion-dollar headlines. She thinks about whether she can hire 3 more controls engineers before her next big contract deadline, whether the new tariff rules will change what she pays for imported components next quarter, and whether the young engineer she's trying to recruit from abroad will actually be able to get a visa approved before a competing offer from Toronto or Dubai becomes too good to turn down. But her small decisions, multiplied across millions of businesses just like hers all across the country, are exactly what will eventually determine whether the story historians tell about America in 2050 looks like the story Gallup is telling about China today, a country that everyone confidently predicted would keep winning right up until the moment the data told a completely different story. The lesson embedded in every single one of these numbers, from the $100 trillion global growth projection down to the price of a median home in Ohio, is not that America is guaranteed to remain number one, and it is not that America is destined to be overtaken either. It is that economic leadership, at every point in modern history, has never been a permanent title handed out once and kept forever. It gets re-earned continuously through the unglamorous, unrecorded decisions happening right now inside research labs pursuing quantum breakthroughs, immigration offices processing or delaying skilled worker visas, city councils debating whether to approve more housing construction, venture capital firms deciding which robotics startup gets the next $100 million, and congressional committees deciding whether the next budget adds another $1 trillion in interest payments the country will still be paying off for decades. The countries and companies that treat the current moment as a finish line, $100 trillion reached, a mission accomplished, tend to be exactly the ones that get overtaken by the countries, and companies still treating it as the starting line for the next race. Every leading indicator worth watching right now, workforce engagement, unicorn creation, skilled immigration, semiconductor and quantum investment, housing affordability, and the sustainability of government finances, is telling a slightly different part of the same underlying story, and none of them alone tells you who wins in 2050. But together, they tell you exactly where to look if you actually want to understand what happens next, long before the next headline announces the next impossible-sounding number. There is one more layer to this story worth sitting with, because it explains why so many ordinary Americans feel a strange disconnect between the economic headlines and their own daily lives. Well, corporate profits and stock market indexes have been setting fresh records through 2026, and on paper that looks like unambiguous good news, the kind of chart every financial network loves to put on screen. But dig one level deeper and a more complicated picture emerges, because a huge share of those record profits and record valuations are concentrated in a remarkably small number of companies, mostly the handful of technology giants building and operating the AI infrastructure boom in the first place. When investment in software and data centers contributes more to quarterly growth than the entire consumer economy, as it did in early 2026, that growth is not spread evenly across every zip code and every industry. It is concentrated in specific metro areas, specific universities, and specific supply chains connected to chip design, cloud computing, and advanced manufacturing. Meanwhile, entire regions built around traditional retail, legacy manufacturing, or industries slower to adopt automation are not seeing anywhere near the same benefit, even though they are paying the same higher grocery prices, the same higher rents, and the same higher mortgage rates as everyone else. This is part of why economists increasingly talk about a two-speed economy inside the United States. One speed racing ahead on AI capital expenditure and elite technology hiring, and another speed barely keeping pace with inflation, still recovering from the labor market disruptions of the pandemic years, and now facing new uncertainty from tariff policy and a cooling job market outside the technology sector. Wages have technically been rising faster than home prices for the first time in several years, according to data tracked through 2026, which sounds like genuinely encouraging news, except affordability measured against decades of accumulated price growth remains historically brutal, meaning a bit of relative improvement does not undo years of a gap that widened far faster than typical incomes ever could. Universities sit at another crucial pressure point in this entire competitiveness story, because America's research institutions have long been considered one of its deepest and most durable advantages, the pipeline that turns federal research funding and international graduate students into the next generation of startups, patents, and Nobel-level breakthroughs. Partnerships between major research universities and private technology companies have intensified through 2026, particularly around AI safety research, quantum materials science, and biotechnology, precisely because both sides recognize that neither government funding alone nor private capital alone moves fast enough on its own to keep pace with global competition. But that same university system is now caught in the same immigration bind squeezing companies like Elena's, because a meaningful share of graduate students in engineering, computer science, and physical sciences at top American universities come from abroad, and visa uncertainty, processing delays, and rising fees make studying in the United States a noticeably riskier bet than it was even 5 years earlier. Every foreign graduate student who chooses a university in Canada, the United Kingdom, or increasingly Singapore and the Gulf states instead of Stanford, MIT, or Georgia Tech, represents a small but real transfer of future innovation capacity away from American soil, the exact kind of slow-moving, hard-to-measure shift that never shows up cleanly in a quarterly GDP report, but compounds over a decade into something very visible. Energy is the other quiet variable running underneath every part of this story, because none of the AI data center build-out, none of the quantum foundries, none of the advanced manufacturing reshoring happens without an enormous and rapidly growing supply of reliable electricity. Data centers alone are expected to consume a dramatically larger share of total American electricity demand by the end of the decade than they did just a few years ago. And utilities across multiple states have already flagged growing strain on existing power grids, with some regions seeing electricity price increases directly tied to the surge in data center construction nearby. This creates a genuinely uncomfortable trade-off for policymakers, because the same AI investment boom driving so much of America's headline economic growth is simultaneously pushing up electricity costs for ordinary households and businesses that have nothing to do with artificial intelligence, adding yet another line item to the affordability squeeze already visible in housing. Clean energy investment, from solar and battery storage to next-generation nuclear and geothermal projects, is racing to close that gap, and billions of dollars are flowing into exactly these sectors, precisely because whichever country solves the energy bottleneck first gains a durable advantage in everything downstream of it, from AI training capacity to advanced chip manufacturing to quantum computing operations that require enormous and extremely stable power supplies to function at all. Elena has started asking her own utility provider pointed questions about long-term electricity capacity for her expanding factory floor, something she never had to think about 5 years ago when her company was small enough that power availability was simply assumed rather than negotiated. Step back far enough and the full shape of the story becomes clear. The headline number, whether it is $100 trillion globally or $32 trillion for the United States alone, captures a real and historic achievement, the product of genuine innovation, genuine capital formation, and genuine entrepreneurial energy concentrated more heavily inside America than almost anywhere else on Earth. But that same headline number sits directly on top of a foundation still being actively negotiated in real time through skilled immigration policy that keeps swinging between welcoming and openly hostile, through a national debt trajectory that grows heavier with every passing year, through a housing market that keeps pricing out the very workers the technology economy needs to keep functioning, through an energy grid straining to keep pace with computational demand. Nobody fully modeled a decade ago and through two rising powers, one slowing down deliberately to fix its own structural imbalances, and one accelerating specifically because its demographic and technological timing finally lined up. None of these forces move in isolation, and none of them guarantee a particular outcome by 2050. What they guarantee is that the answer to whether America stays number one will not be decided by the size of today's GDP figure, no matter how record-breaking that figure sounds on the day it gets announced. It will be decided by whether the country can keep doing the much harder, much less glamorous work of building enough housing, training and welcoming enough skilled workers, generating enough reliable energy, keeping its research universities genuinely open to the best minds on Earth, and managing its own government finances responsibly enough that today's growth is not simply borrowed from a decade that has not happened yet. Helena Torres will keep building robots in Columbus regardless of how any of this ultimately resolves, because that is simply what entrepreneurs do. Adapt to whatever conditions actually exist, rather than the conditions they wish existed. But multiply her choices, her hiring decisions, her energy negotiations, and her long-term bets on where to expand next, by the millions of similar decisions happening inside companies across every state in the country. And you get the real answer to the question this entire story keeps circling back to. $100 trillion in new global economic energy really is coming, exactly as described, and it really will rain down across every country on Earth over the next 25 years. The only question left, the one no forecaster, no economist, and no headline can answer in advance, is which countries build the foundation solid enough to actually catch it when it lands.